Nista kakia no temtik no akomagnak nista nenaskemun. Papikskid ne heon absisi kenaskom teno kakia no temtik. Tapemias kenaskom tin ogimau Frederick kenaskom tin. Kakia ogimau kenaskom tin wow. Anots mi okiskao no tawinan cemento kenaskom tin. Just a little bit in Cree. I'm very happy to be here acknowledging you all as friends and relatives. Acknowledging this beautiful day and giving thanks to the Creator for this beautiful day, and acknowledging the Chief for hosting us here in his traditional territory. Chief Frederick, thank you so much. This morning as well, over breakfast, it was good to sit with the ministers and really good conversation about reconciliation. And I'm very thankful to be here this morning, and I want to do all my proper protocols, as is our tradition amongst First Nations people, and acknowledging some of the leadership from around this territory. Because when I was invited to come to speak, I thought, industry is there, that's good. Governments are there, federal, provincial governments, municipal governments, First Nations governments are there. And when you ever bring all these people together, it's all about relationship building. That's what it's about. Building respectful relationships. And so I want to take the time just to acknowledge some of the chiefs that are doing good things, and the local tribal council as well. So I want to read these names. So I want to, like last night they had a good meal at the Keg, so it was good. Shout out to the Keg in Prince George. They have a major projects coalition team, and that's very important. So I want to acknowledge the leadership there. Councillor Charlene Gale is chair of the coalition. Chief Karina Lewin, she's vice chair of the coalition from the Chislada Carrier Nation. She's here in front. Chief Jackie Thomas from the, I want to say this right, the Saikus First Nation. Close? Because I speak Cree and yeah, it's tough, all these different nations and languages. Chief Larry Noski from the Neidla Wet'en First Nation. Chief Archie Patrick from Stillatin First Nation. And as well as Nilo Edwards, he's the coalition executive director. I want to acknowledge them for their leadership of what they're trying to do. You know, coming together to work on a project that's very big for them, the mine, Kenny Dam, and how they've got to work with the provincial government here in British Columbia to make that a reality. Because it's not only about fixing the river system, but that's what it's mainly about, the environment and bringing salmon back to that territory. But it's also about creating jobs and wealth and all of that. But that's secondary. The first thing was fixing the environmental piece. So I want to acknowledge them, and I lift them up for your leadership. I want to give you a shout out. Round of applause for them. The Deputy Tribal Chief, Reg Mueller, is here. And I just met him this morning. And working with 8 bands, 8 First Nations from the Carrier-Sicani Tribal Council. And even though historically there might have been a little bit of conflict between industry and the Tribal Council, you also have to take that extra effort to continue to build upon that relationship and find common ground. And that was the message I wanted to start off with here between industry and First Nations. You might be in conflict sometimes, but take the extra time to find common ground. And it's almost like that old saying, before you build anything, build that respectful relationship. So I wanted to lift up the Carrier-Sicani Tribal Council as well from the host territory here. And I want to also recommend in the future, because the chief of the Carrier-Sicani Tribal Council, Chief Terry Chiji, is also the new regional chief for British Columbia, who's part of my team nationally. I would have loved to see him invited here as well. I also want to take the time now to acknowledge the speakers, Mayor Lynn Hall from Prince George, Mike Morris, the MLA, Mr. Todd Doherty, the Member of Parliament, and Gareth Manderson from Rio Tinto. I love the accent. You know, it's Australia. It's good. That's not a knife. It's that's a knife. It shows that Canada, provinces, territories, we can operate in a global economy, no question. But it's all about natural resources. So now bringing my attention to the text here, what I want to, the message in Canada, the Natural Resources Forum here in British Columbia. And across Canada, across Turtle Island, there's millions upon millions upon millions of resources that can be developed. And the simple message is they can only be developed in a good way, in a very effective way, in a very efficient way, if it's done in partnership with First Nations people. And whether you're talking about the Ring of Fire in Northern Ontario, or whether you're talking about uranium in Northern Saskatchewan, or potash in Southern Saskatchewan, or the timber issue here in British Columbia, the softwood lumber issue, it's all about partnering with First Nations people. Because we say in the most respectful way that we're not trying to create economic uncertainty. When you include First Nations people, you create economic certainty. Because we always talk about assumed crown sovereignty and assumed crown jurisdiction. Because the doctrine of terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery, those concepts of how a country would come here, the Christian countries, and plant a flag and somehow gain title to the land and territories and resources, well, on one hand, that might be good, but from a First Nations perspective, you kind of look at it and go, what's wrong with that picture? And so we have to deal with that, but in a respectful way. So that concept of terra nullius, and which is vacant land, and the concept of the doctrine of discovery, when you plant a flag and it somehow becomes the crown. So that a concept of assumed crown sovereignty, assumed crown jurisdiction is starting to fast become, not only in Canada but throughout the world, viewed as an illegal and racist doctrine. And so how do we deal with that in a respectful way? Not to create economic certainty, but to involve First Nations people in a respectful dialogue, because it's all about rights recognition, Aboriginal rights and title, treaty and inherent rights, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, all of these things come to be. But it really is a simple way about working together and making sure there's a respectful place for dialogue. And that, again, I'm going to stress to industry, to all the CEOs here, before you build anything, build a respectful relationship with First Nations people. And I just want to, as an example of that good relationship, I was chief at Little Black Bear First Nation for a number of years. And BHP, they're a potash, multi-billion-dollar industry, potash company. The president from BHP came out to Little Black Bear and spent a whole day with me. President Tim Cutt, he came out, we toured the reserve, visited the elders, we had a teepee set up, we had buffalo robes, we feasted, we had pipe ceremony, we had everything done in our way. And it was to build a relationship, because they're talking about building a potash mine maybe about half an hour from my reservation. And let me tell you, just by doing that, taking the time to come out and break bread, feast, ceremony, we built such a good relationship and respectful, that when he brought his board of directors for BHP, and this is an international company, BHP, and they came into Saskatchewan, and little competition in Saskatchewan was pretty good. We used to have the big three, Potash and Mosaic and all those other ones, Potash. But when BHP came in, it was a good, competition was good. But when he had his board of directors come in, who did he call on to come and make a presentation about inherent rights and treaty rights and how do you build a respectful relationship and work together? And he start talking about procurement. You start talking about a representative workforce strategy. You start talking about revenue sharing streams back, all these things. I was called in and talking to the whole board at BHP. So that's the simple message. Let's build a relationship. It took a day to do it. More time than that, but he took the time to come out. And I just share that as an example to all the CEOs and presidents in the room, is to take the time to go out and meet the chiefs and councils. And you're right, when the individual talked about the diversity. In Canada, you have 638 First Nations right across. You have 203 in British Columbia. You've got 47 in Alberta. You've got 74 in Saskatchewan. You've got 66 in Manitoba. You have 134 in Ontario. You've got 47 in La Belle Province de Quebec. You've got 33 on the East Coast. You've got 14 in the Yukon. You've got 28 in Northwest Territories. You have 58 different nations and languages and tribes. You have 34 here in British Columbia, different nations and languages. You'd almost think I'm running for national chief when I knew those numbers, eh? It's just that diversity. And you need to know there's differences. And we respect those differences. Different languages, different relationships with governments. In this territory here, you have treaty, non-treaty, but you have the Douglas treaties on Vancouver Island, you have Treaty 8 territory in northern BC, you have the modern day treaties, the Nisga'a, Sechelt, and yes, you have to know the organizations. The Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs, led by Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, the First Nation Summit, led by Grand Chief Ed John, BC Leadership Council, now led by Regional Chief Terry Teegee. So you have to know how that's structured. How are we structured? You have to know all of that. And get to know them, those people and those leaders, in a respectful way. I also want to give a shout out to one of the First Nations here in British Columbia, Chief Gord Planis, the Sauk First Nation. And I'll preface this statement or this shout out to Chief Gord in the sense that you talked about the wildfires in British Columbia. You also see the floods right across Canada. You also see the big winds, the hurricanes. Something is happening to Mother Earth. You can see that happening right across Canada, but right throughout the world. You see snow in the Sahara Desert. You see how climate change is affecting everything. Dealing with greenhouse gas emissions, dealing with that whole issue of climate change is one of the fundamental number one issues, not only for Canada, but for the world. And it's our elders that have constantly said and predicted, oh, wow, be careful, no some. Watch, because north will become south, east will become west. Watch the animals, look what they're doing. Everything is changing because of climate change. And so as industry and as governments, federal, provincial, municipal, First Nations, putting our attention to how we can transition faster from our dependency on fossil fuels to clean energy. We need to do that collectively as not only Canada, but the world. Because we need to think 7 generations. And we're not saying shut off the pipelines and close down oil and gas. We're all driving cars. We're flying in airplanes. You always hear that. We get it. But the plan to quickly transition to clean energy is really needed. And I was at COP21 in Paris when Prime Minister Trudeau got up and made that statement about First Nations knowing and about protecting the land for many, many years, and then how we have to get involved with protecting the land and water and making sure that we're involved in any kind of, I just wanted to look for the quote, and here it was. Prime Minister told the world, Indigenous people have known for thousands of years how to care for our planet. The rest of us have a lot to learn and no time to waste. That was his quote. And so we hang on to that. And I think that's a really good message. And so to industry, no, we're not saying shut everything down, but transition. Because we also see the impact on the economy. We also see the impact on the environment. And we always say balancing the environment and the economy is really key, which is why you need First Nations people involved. We'll find that sweet spot. We'll find the right mix. Because we want development as well, but not at any cost. We want development. We want jobs. We want to create wealth. We want to create employment. Nothing wrong with having rich Indians too. But in a respectful way, a balanced way, making sure we have things for future generations. Now we say to Gord Planis, that's kind of a model. I don't know if you've ever been down to the Sauk First Nation just outside Victoria. Doing really good things, all solar. Planning was based on 7 generation teachings, planning 100 years ahead. They installed large photovoltaic systems and solar hot water systems on 40 homes. 10 people received training in installing solar hot water systems and worked with contractors in placing those systems on half the houses on the reserve and in the community kitchen. That's how they started off. They got involved in energy conservation initiatives when Souk discovered that it cost just 1/10 the price to save energy as it does to produce it. The unexpected side benefit for Souk's solar project was that the nation created a unique and very successful ecotourism program. They've since added a greenhouse and are not only bolstering their own food supply, they're selling to markets around the world. That's a success story. Souk, that's 1 out of the 638. Transitioning from diesel to microgrids. There's so many things in Northern Ontario, parts of BC that can happen. It's all based on that premise. Move quicker to clean energy solutions. Sustainable clean energy, energy independence, food security, economic independence, these are all interconnected. And they're all priorities for First Nations people. We talk about the inherent right to self-determination, the inherent right to self-government, but that really has to be linked to economic self-sufficiency. They go hand in hand. No longer do we want to administer our own poverty. It's how we say it. Our chiefs say that all the time. We don't want to administer poverty. You want nations that are thriving. Good quality homes, good quality access to water, good education for our kids, so they can compete not only nationally but globally. That's what we want, and that's good for everybody. So this word, inherent right to self-government, it really has to be linked to economic self-sufficiency as well. And that's the goal and the challenge when you start talking about developing our natural resource wealth. What I want to say as well, reaching out, and I mentioned some of the First Nations in the territory. And again, just to keep stressing, you should know who they are. What are their ideas, their thoughts? How can you build that respectful relationship? Maybe have your board meeting out in the First Nations community. You know, I used to work at Crown Investments Corporation, Saskatchewan, and there was 3 things we used to always push for, right? And I was going to ask a question to the ministers this morning. You almost had quorum for cabinet there, for the BC government. You had a number of ministers. And one of the things I used to ask all the provincial governments across Canada is a simple policy change. Because when it comes to licenses and permits, who issues those a lot? It's governments. In some cases the federal government, in most cases provinces, provincial governments. And so I used to say this. If you want to create key strategic partnerships and generate economic growth and create economic stability in your provinces, think about a simple policy change. Think about it in this regard, and this was going to be my question to the ministers this morning. If they're still here, I'm going to ask you this. Think about what if the province of British Columbia looked at a policy change in the sense that before you issue a license or permit to any private sector industry operating in the province of British Columbia to go and take the trees, develop the trees, or have access to aluminum, whatever private industry operating, that they should demonstrate that they've got a strategy or policy as it relates to First Nations people's engagement. So if they they come to the provincial governments and ask for a license or permit. And so the question should be, do you have a strategy and plan on procurement for First Nations businesses? Do you have a strategy or plan on representative workforce strategy within your company? Do you have a strategy or plan for benefit sharing back? And if you don't give them a license or permit. You'll see, and that's a simple policy change. It's not legislation. A simple policy change. You will see key strategic partnerships and initiatives between private sector and First Nations. And that's key. That's good for the economy. Whether it happens in BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, who cares? Right across Canada, if that was a simple policy change. Because we used to always hold up Cameco in Saskatchewan. Uranium, multi-billion-dollar company in the uranium industry. They got 54% Aboriginal workforce. They've got First Nations people on their board of directors. They've got First Nations people on their management teams. So right throughout. Why did that happen? Simple change in Saskatchewan at that level. For that one particular industry. I wanted it expanded to potash and everything else too. But it was for that one. So just use that as an example. That's a thought. Maybe, why can't that happen? dialogue about that. I think you're going to create key strategic alliances when that happens. Because private business, private sector now are looking how to do that. How do we do that together? I also want to say that knowing the First Nations leadership is important, but knowing as well the legal landscape. And I always lift up the Chilcotin Nation. 25 years, the Williams case. Aboriginal rights and title recognized and affirmed. Supreme Court decision, the Chilcotin. I don't know if Grand Chief Joe Alphonse is here, but he's a big guy. I wouldn't want to play hockey against him. He's a heck of a hockey player. But the Chilcotin Nation, for 25 years, battling it out, have won that Supreme Court decision. And so now, Aboriginal rights and title are there, and something we've always recognized, always something we knew. How do we exert that? How do we implement that? How do we recognize it? How is it given life? The Chilcotin case. And as First Nations leaders, and just I'm sure your legal counsels that you have in your departments, we always talk about Siwi case, the Sparrow case, the Guring case, the Calder case, the Chilcotin case, Delgamuuk, all these Supreme Court wins. We're winning hugely in that Supreme Court of Canada. Aboriginal rights and title cases and treaty cases. So the judicial branch of government is saying something very clearly. Rights recognition. The legislative and the executive branch of governments have to keep up with what the judicial branch is saying. And that's the challenge going forward now with Prime Minister Trudeau and Cabinet to fix all of the laws and policies in Canada that aren't in line with the Chilcotin case, the Delgamuuk case, aren't in line with the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So fixing the comprehensive claims policy, fixing the specific claims policy, fixing the additions to reserve policy, fixing the inherent right to self-government policy, because they're currently all based on termination of rights and title, not recognition. So that has to be fixed. So I just wanted to give a shout out to the Chilcotin Nation. But now, industry is saying, and then we use these words, duty to consult and accommodate, duty to consult and accommodate, free prior and informed consent. What does that mean? It's the Crown that has the obligation to make sure that there's that duty to consult and accommodate policy, process, and plan in place. And sometimes it's good and sometimes it's gray. And so which is why industry starts to step up to the plate. So industry is starting to take it upon yourselves to try and meet those thresholds. But it's the Crown that has that obligation. Governments that have that obligation for duty to consult and accommodate. And then we say go one step further because UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has been passed. Start using free prior informed consent. And Mr. Duncan brought up this morning about the word veto. As 634 First Nations across Canada, we respect that right to self-determination, which is the right to say yes and or the right to say no. And we're diverse. We have First Nations that produce oil and gas that want to get their product to market as well. Expand from the USA, because I'm going to talk about NAFTA in a little bit. And looking at other world markets to get the resource to. We have pipelines cutting across ancestral lands. You have pipelines coming to the coast. You talk about LNG, wood fiber. All these industries have impacts. And some are really supporting. And the First Nations that are supporting, I'm saying, and they're also saying, we don't just want IBAs, impact benefit agreements. Why don't we look at equity ownership in some of these mega projects? Why can't we find creative ways to have access to capital? Bond rating agencies, government-backed guarantee, loan guarantees, all these things can happen because access to capital is one of the biggest hurdles. So finding ways to do that. So we have a diverse range of First Nations, no question. But again, it's always about balance between the economy, the environment, the economy. And so we respect the ones that say yes, though also respect the ones that say no. Even in the sense where our Assembly of First Nations And quite clearly, we're not a government. We're an organization that advocates on behalf of the rights and title owners, which are the First Nations themselves and their people on their land and territory. So when I do a structural organizational structure diagram, we acknowledge, of course, the creator, then the people, then we acknowledge the leadership, the chiefs and councils, the hereditary chiefs, the clan mothers, however that nation is set up to run. Then you have these agencies, then you have tribal councils, then you have PTOs, and you have the AFNs on the bottom, not the top. So my home reserve Little Black Bear is just one of 638. We're part of the Cree Nation, and we entered into Treaty 4. Constance on this side. So AFN's on the bottom. So this side, again, to advocate, you have to know what do we mean by nation to nation. And now more and more First Nations are coming back to that by their language and getting organized. Because we're moving beyond this thing called the Indian Act, which has been in place since 1876. And we're starting to exert our own nationhood. We're a nation within a nation. We have our own lands, our own laws, our own languages, our own people, our own identifiable forms of government. 5 elements for that inherent right to self-determination we recognize. So we say we're not ethnic minorities. We're indigenous peoples with that inherent right. And we're starting to move beyond the Indian Act now. Create our own laws. That's the challenge going forward. How does that look? And it's different in every province and territory. But there is movement towards those nation-to-nation concept, that nationhood concept. I also want to say, when we meet with government, and we've had Prime Minister Trudeau come to speak to our chiefs twice, we'll hopefully have him at our next assembly, but he talked about missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls, implementing all TRC calls to action, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, talked about removing the 2% funding cap, working towards a new fiscal relationship, talked about education, and as well talked about law and policy review. Last year he came and said 3 things. We'll work with the Assembly of First Nations to have an Indigenous Language Revitalization Act in legislation. We'll work with the AFN to make sure that there is a legal framework for the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And he also mentioned law and policy. So language, UN Declaration, laws and policies to be fixed. Lots of work to do. And we're using this beautiful English language. Mais oui, je parle français un petit peu en français, s'il vous plaît. Bienvenue tout le monde. C'est très important à mes yeux. French. Beautiful languages, French. But we've got 58 indigenous languages. Very important to hang on to language. Because to the people here, even when young First Nations men and women are fluent in their language, they're more successful in school and therefore more successful in life. Therefore, even looking at language revitalization, language retention, language rejuvenation is very fundamental to our identity, and that can happen, and that's going to happen. I'm going to wrap up, I know, soon. I got 2 little pages left. The importance, we've talked about business, which is good for the Canadian economy. I want to talk about the gap that needs to be closed. And this gap is, I'm going to keep talking about it until there is no gap. According to the United Nations Human Development Index, Canada is rated 6th, up high. But when you apply the same indices to our people, we're 63rd. So it's 6th versus 63rd. And this gap represents everything we're trying to change. It represents the overcrowded housing. It represents the 132 boil water advisories. It represents the 1,200 plus missing murdered Indigenous women and girls. It represents the high youth suicide rate. It represents the disproportionate number of people in jails. Not good. It represents 40,000 children in foster care. It's not good. So how do we close this gap? And that's where investments in education and training come in. That's where we need to work together. That's where we need to make sure that young First Nations men and women, this is the fastest growing segment of Canada's population. So to industry and to governments, invest in human capital. Young First Nations men and women. Fastest growing segment. You have a human capital labor. If you invest in labor capital, you're going to have huge returns on investment in the future. math and science, literacy, numeracy, K to 12, engineering, university, all of that. But equally important is your languages and your ceremonies and your customs and your traditions and who you are. We have to walk in both worlds now. We need both. And I always say this into some chambers of commerces, because establish a program called Try It Twice. Because I used to go everywhere and say, oh, we hired First Nations people once. It didn't work out. So I said, try it twice. Make sure you have a good recruitment strategy, but make sure you have a good retention strategy as well. So try it twice. Invest in human capital. The last thing, once you do that, we have huge positive impacts on Canada's GDP. You get First Nations people educated and trained and working, huge impacts on the economy. You make key strategic partnerships with First Nations people, involvement from day one, not day 2 or day 3, but day 1 before you try to build a mine or any initiative. Build that respectful relationship. On NAFTA, just very quickly, because I'm going to be going to Toronto with Minister Chrystia Freeland on Thursday, that impacts everybody. That impacts the world. USA is Canada's biggest trading partner. And yes, we know there's poison pills in there. Yes, we never know what the heck is going to come out from the USA president's mind and mouth sometimes. In dealing with Chapter 19, dispute resolution is problematic. I think we're bang on by not changing that. The automotive sector, again, is another big issue. You know, the 5-year poison pill reviews of NAFTA. The dairy supply, we're trying to protect Canada's dairy market. But then I come in, because I'm one of the advisors, says, you know, because Canada endorsed the UN Declaration, where is the Indigenous Peoples chapter within NAFTA? We need to update it. We need to modernize it. So I'm really happy to say that Canada has agreed to an Indigenous Peoples chapter. That's a good thing. It's going to create economic certainty, economic stability. So that Indigenous Peoples chapter next Tuesday, because the 4 people from Mexico, the 4 people from USA are coming up to negotiate. They're going to make a response to the Indigenous Peoples chapter. And it's not just about movement of goods and services across Canada-USA border. I would say, we didn't create borders as First Nations people. Man, we're the original free traders here in Turtle Island, you know? That's what we say. So how do we get involved? So that Indigenous Peoples chapter is going to be there. And it is modernizing. But it's updating, but it's recognition. Land and resource rights. It's recognition that we need to be involved on all trade missions, on international trade missions throughout the world. That's very important. It all comes down to implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That's the guide to reconciliation. Embrace that. The last points, just to you as CEOs and people here. The themes of inclusion, respect for rights, close that gap. If we can close that gap, it's not only good for First Nations people, it's good for Canada. And I know if we maintain this 6th versus 63rd gap, there's huge social costs to that gap. Don't maintain the status quo. Look for new ways of doing things. Look for new, innovative, creative partnership solutions together. And that's what we have to go forward between the public sector, the private sector, First Nations, working collectively together. And my last point is this, my very last point, is our worldview. And our worldview is this. We don't see color as First Nations people. Because here, this room, when we go to ceremony, all people pray and acknowledge, we're the 2-legged tribe. So I don't care if you're black, yellow, red, pink. We're the 2-legged peoples, the 2-legged tribe. And in ceremony, our old people, our elders always acknowledge, of course, the Creator. They'll acknowledge the one that sits in the east, one in the south, the west, the north. We'll acknowledge Mother Earth, because everything comes from Mother Earth. We'll acknowledge Father Sky, Grandmother Moon, Grandfather Sun, our relatives, the star people. We'll acknowledge the male plants, the female plants. We'll acknowledge our relatives, the 4-legged ones. They're our relatives. We'll acknowledge the ones that fly, the ones that swim, the ones that crawl. They're our relatives. We'll also acknowledge those 4 grandmother spirits that look after the water. The rainwater, the fresh water, the salt water, and when life comes, that grandmother that looks after when water breaks, that power of women. So when you look at that in that worldview, we're all connected and we're all related. So when First Nations greet you, all my relatives, we're not only acknowledging this two-leggeds, we're acknowledging all of that. And if we can get that into our heads and minds and spirits as CEOs, as ministers, as national chiefs, as relatives, I think we're going to have a bright future 7 generations down the road. So let's work together and make that happen. Thanks for listening.